Grosse Pointe and commercial shipping. It could also be subtitled Namesakes of the Grosse Pointes, as many of the ships you will see were named for famous Grosse Pointers. But first, I would like to give credit for the use of these slides to Ed Morris of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, formerly of Detroit, and his son James Morris, still a Detroit resident, and finally Greg Grudnick, who grew up in the Grosse Pointes and currently resides in Cleveland, Ohio. Before getting on to the Grosse Pointe ships, I would like to quickly trace the history of commercial shipping in the area. Native Indians of the area plied the waters off Grosse Pointe for centuries before Father Louis Hennepin, aboard the 55-foot British ship, the Griffin, exited the waters of the Detroit River on August 12, 1679, and entered the lake, which he named for St. Clair, in commemoration for the saint whose feast day fell on that date. While area Indians carried supplies by canoe, true commercial shipping began in the mid-19th century. The first steamship passed the area in the 1820s. In 1835, a total of 225 sailing vessels, similar to the one shown here, put into harbor in Chicago. Many of these ships carried freight, and most had passed through Lake St. Clair. While the first screw propeller steamer was built in 1841, wooden schooners continued to dominate the scene until the 1890s and were in use until the early 1920s. Shown here is the ship the Ishpeming, built at the J. M. Jones Shipyard, Detroit, in 1872. It was wood-hulled and at 166 feet, about average for the era. The George W. Morley, shown here at right, was built in the 1880s, and although still constructed with an oak hull and at less than 200 feet in length, it was a dramatic departure from the schooners that is shown with. The J.W. Rust, R-U-S-T, another oak-hulled ship, illustrates another development. As good oak grew scarcer and the ships grew bigger, a new type of construction was developed, the composite. These ships had metal frames, and most were planked on the bottom and up to the load line with wood. Above this line, steel plates were put on the metal frames. Only 9 of these ships were built in the 1880s, but they did represent a move towards the steel freighters of the 20th century. At the same time, schooners, which had reached a peak of 1,700 vessels on the Great Lakes in the 1870s, began to disappear. The last full-rigged schooner built on the lakes was launched as the Cora A in 1889. This same year saw the launching of McDougall's Dream. This was not the ship's name, but rather a new ship design by a gentleman named Alexander McDougall. These ships became known as the whalebacks. By 1898, 43 had been launched. All of the whalebacks were built in Duluth and West Superior, Wisconsin. Here you see at left the steamer John Erickson with consort barge Alexander Holly. A consort barge would be towed by the other freighter, thus doubling capacity. Here we see the John Erickson again on June 22nd, 1961, during her last year of operation. This ship was laid up for 7 additional years after this before being scrapped in 1968. The designer's intention with these ships was to strip the ships just to the essentials with a blunt snout boring through the water. Here we see the whaleback, the Meteor, as it appears today as a museum of shipping in Superior, Wisconsin. It was the last whaleback to run. Ending its career in 1969, it became a museum, as shown here in 1973. Incidentally, one passenger whaleback, very similar to this ship, was built as the Christopher Columbus in 1893. It had a completely white hull, and it ran out of the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair, of course, at the time, in Chicago, to various lake ports. Here we see the Schuylkill, a 293-foot passenger freighter built in 1872. It was operated by the Anchor Line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The government, through antitrust laws and legislation, outlawed railroad ownership of lake freighters in 1918. This ship was sunk in the Atlantic Ocean by torpedo during World War I. Here's the Goderich, built in 1906. It was one of the first modern freighters. At 600 feet in length with a beam or width of 60 feet, this size and style of ship ruled the lakes for almost 80 years. This particular ship was scrapped in 1983. Shortly, when we discuss Grosse Pointe related ships, you will see that most are of this modern design. The Loch St. Anne, shown here, was built in 1925 and was also 600 feet by 60 foot of beam or width. It was scrapped in 1983. All of these ships had superstructures, that is, cabins at fore and aft or front and rear, with a long flat deck in between. The 1940s saw a continued lengthening of lake freighters, as you see here, with the Meldrum Bay, built in 1949, at 640 feet in length. The St Lawrence Seaway opened in 1959, truly making the Great Lakes the fourth coast of the United States. This seaway was built to handle ships up to 730 feet in length with a 75-foot beam or width. An example of this is the Mckee, shown here. Other specialized ships were built in the 1960s through 80s. Here is the Fred R. White Jr. At 620 feet is the maximum length ship capable of squeezing up the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. The first 1,000-foot freighter, the Stuart Court, left Erie, Pennsylvania on May 1st, 1972, and passed the Grosse Pointes on May 4th, 1972, creating a traffic jam on Lakeshore Drive that was documented in the Grosse Pointe News. With a 105-foot beam and capable of carrying 50,000 gross tons of iron ore pellets, it is still one of the largest ships on the lakes today, although one ship has been built at 1,016 feet in length. Another 1,000-footer, the Bell River, was built in 1977, as shown here, with no pilot house at the front, but rather than at the aft. It looks much like the super freighters that you see carrying oil and other products across the oceans. This ship runs between the St. Clair Edison plant in St. Clair, Michigan, of course, and Duluth, and thus it does not pass the Grosse Pointes, but it was renamed in the fall of 1990 the Walter J. McCarthy. Mr. McCarthy, of course, was chairman of Detroit Edison until his retirement in 1990. The Jupiter, shown here, was specially built for petroleum products in 1979, and it carried aviation fuel until it exploded and sank in the Saginaw River in the fall of 1990. The last specialized type of ship that we will mention is the railroad train and car carrier. The Midland, shown here, was one of the last ships to run across Lake Michigan. It ran from Ludington, Michigan to Kewanee, Wisconsin. Moving on to the namesakes of the lakes of Grosse Pointe or other ships owned by Grosse Pointers, I offer the following. Shown here is the ship the Benjamin Noble. Benjamin Noble was born in 1859 in St. John's, New Brunswick. Moving to Detroit in 1885, he became president of Capital Brass Works, where he served until his death in 1926. The Nobles resided in Indian Village until mid-1920s, moving to 467 University, where Mrs. Noble lived until her death in the mid-1940s. This ship was launched in 1909 at Wyandotte, Michigan. It was 249 feet in length, and it went down in a severe storm on Lake Superior on April 27, 1914. Homer Warren was born on December 11, 1855, in Romeo, Michigan, receiving a bachelor's degree from Albion College. He settled in Detroit in 1872. In 1888, he organized the Homer Warren and Company real estate brokers. In this field, he controlled large portions of downtown Detroit. He was Detroit postmaster from 1906 through 1913 and was then president of the Chamber of Commerce of Detroit until 1925. He died in Detroit on August 17, 1928. Warren Avenue was named in his honor. The Warrens resided in Indian Village until moving to 46 Lewiston around the time of Mr. Warren's death. His namesake was a wooden-hulled package freighter of 180 feet. It had been built in 1863 as a passenger ship. It was renamed the Homer Warren in 1900. It had a carrying capacity of 505,000 board feet of lumber. It sank on Lake Ontario on October 28, 1919, while carrying a load of coal. All 9 crewmen were lost. It was the oldest wooden straight deck freighter in operation at the time of this loss. George Rupert Fink was born in 1886 in Pennsylvania. He was closely identified with steelmaking in Detroit. He organized and operated Michigan Steel Corporation and Great Lakes Steel Corporation on Zug Island. After Great Lakes Steel merged with National Steel, he moved up to the position of president of this company. He resided at 69 Cloverleigh until his death in the early 1960s, when his widow moved to 65 Tonacor. His namesake ship was built in 1923 and was renamed in his honor in 1952. It was 600 feet in length, and it was scrapped in Spain in 1973. J.W. Wescott, although never a Grosse Pointe resident, did, as a Great Lakes ship captain, establish the first Lake Channel range light off of Grosse Pointe and first light ship in Lake St. Clair in 1873. The following year, he established a marine reporting agency known as J.W. Wescott Company. While this firm has been situated at several locations on the Detroit River, it has been at the foot of 24th Street near the Ambassador Bridge for the last several decades. The first ship, shown here, named the J.W. Wescott, was 175 feet in length. It was built in 1883 and was scrapped in 1918. The second ship, named J.W. Wescott, is the only mail boat in the world. Mr. Wescott died, by the way, on August 17, 1913, in Ann Arbor. Here, the second ship, the J.W. Wescott, is shown from the Ambassador Bridge, going about its daily duty of delivering mail to ships along the lakes. Although not very clear, 3 crew members stand along the railing, lowering a bucket, which is then filled with the crew member's mail and is then raised back up to the ship and distributed to the crew. Ralph Stone Caulkins was born in Grosse Pointe on May 23, 1923, and earned a degree from Yale University in metallurgical engineering in 1943. In 1949, he joined the Waterworks Navigation Company at Detroit as vice president. This firm at the time was headed by his father, Henry Lewis Caulkins, who first resided at 502 Lincoln, then 102 Lewiston, and finally 220 Lewiston until the 1980s when he passed away. Meanwhile, Ralph Caulkins, his son, moved to Fort Lauderdale around 1960. While still working for Waterworks Navigation Company and still living in Fort Lauderdale, he no longer maintains any kind of residence in Grosse Pointe. Here his namesake is shown off of Detroit in the mid-1960s. This ship was built in 1902. It was 434 feet in length and was scrapped in 1963. Here it is shown shortly before scrapping with the terminal tower in downtown Cleveland in the background. The Browning family had 3 ships named for various family members in addition to owning a number of other ships. Mcpherson Browning lived at 420 Rivard until his death in the 1950s, when his wife moved to Whittier Towers in Detroit, living there until her passing in the mid-1960s. Ironically, Mcpherson Browning, the only Browning listed in the Detroit area social secretary, never had a ship named for him. Meanwhile, his cousins Lorenzo Dowell Browning and T.H. Browning, and the ship the T.H. Browning is shown here, and Lorenzo's son Michael Gorry, G-O-R-R-Y Browning, all had ships named for them. Lorenzo and his son lived for several years in Grosse Pointe Farms, although I was unable to locate an address. The L.T. Browning, of course, was named for Lorenzo Dowell, D-O-W-L Browning, who was born in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1914. Moving to Detroit in 1922, he began sailing on Great Lakes ships in 1938. In 1946, he joined Nicholson University Steamship Company and became company vice president of operations and charter manager of the company in the 1950s. The Brownings also purchased Boblo Island operations, including the ships Columbia and St. Clair in the mid-1950s. The LD Browning, shown here, was built in 1896 as the Corella. After being renamed the TH Browning in 1949 for LD's brother, it was given its last name, LD Browning, in 1952. Although it was the largest ship on the lakes in 1896 at 432 feet, it proved too small and old for continued operations, and it was scrapped in 1953. I'm sorry, it was used as a storage bin beginning in 1955 and was finally scrapped in 1962. Here's a shot from the stern. The Michael D. Browning, second ship here from the left, ironically right next to the ship named for his father, L.D. Browning. Of course, Mr. Browning, Michael D. Browning, was the oldest son of L.D. Browning. He entered the U.S. Army and served in Vietnam. He was born in Detroit in 1946 and graduated from Notre Dame University in 1968 when he joined the Army. He was 10 years old when a ship of 440 feet in length that had been built in 1907 was named for him by his father. The Michael D. Browning was sold for grain storage in 1959. Interestingly enough, shown next to his father's namesake, both were filled with grain at the time of this photograph in 1962. The Michael D. Browning arrived in Genoa, Italy for scrapping on November 20th, 1964. Here we see the W. Wayne Hancock, another Browning line ship, followed by our next subject, the ship the St. Clair. This ship, tied to Grosse Pointe by its name, St. Clair, named for the saint who died on August 11th, 1253, and who was buried on what became her feast day the next day, August 12th, in the year 1253. The spelling of this ship was changed in keeping with the French spelling. It, of course, is also tied to the Grosse Pointes by its longtime owners, the Browning family. And here is an early shot of the ship with these listing on the side, Boblo Company, a Browning line. The St. Clair was built in 1910 by Toledo Shipbuilding Company and was, of course, I should say, runs primarily between Detroit and Boblo Island. Although this year it will also run to Port Huron on the annual Memorial Day cruise, which was just revived 3 years ago, but which was sailed for many years consecutively in the 60s and early 70s. There's an additional shot of the St. Clair from the Ambassador Bridge. Still another shot. Here we see the St. Clair from the deck of its sister ship, the Columbia. The Columbia, of course, is named for the United States of America. It was built in 1902 by Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Wyandotte. These ships represent the last steamships which are used for passengers on the Great Lakes. The Columbia is 216 feet by 60 foot in width, or beam, and the St. Clair is 197 feet by 65 feet. The Brownings sold Boblo Island and the Boblo boats in 1979. The next Grosse Pointe ship mentioned will be the Mckeesons. Max Mckee was born in 1891. He lived at 231 Lakeshore until his passing in the early 1970s. His namesake has the distinction of having more namesakes than any other Great Lakes vessel. Actually, the ship Mckeeson's was named for his three sons, Robert, Bradshaw, and Brent, along with the 8 sons of his 2 brothers. The entire family still share a common interest in the Sand Products Corporation of Detroit. The ship, the Mckeesons, carries a hoist called a self-unloader, as you can see here. This crane is capable of moving 20,000 tons of iron ore sand, or other products from this ship in 30 minutes. The mechanism was developed by George H. Hullett, H-U-L-E-T-T, in 1899. The ship, the Mckeesons, was launched in 1945 as the Marine Angel. It was renamed the Mckeesons in 1953. At 633 feet in length and relatively new, one would think that it would still be in use today, but it has been laid up in Toledo since 1981. The Chemical Ford family had two ships named in their honor. John Battice, that is B-A-T-T-I-C-E, Ford, was born in New Albany, Indiana on October 25, 1866. In the 1890s, he helped found Michigan Alkali Company, now part of BASF Wyandotte, becoming that company's president and general manager in 1898. He retired as company president in 1939. He also founded Huron Portland Cement, which, by the way, has one terminal just east of the Renaissance Center in downtown Detroit, and he founded this company in 1907. Additionally, the Ford building next to the Penobscot building in downtown Detroit was built under his direction in 1908. Mr. Ford died on October 8, 1941. His namesake, shown here, was built by American Steamship Building Company in Lorain, Ohio in 1904. It was renamed the J.B. Ford in 1959. While still in existence, it has been used as a cement storage barge since 1986 in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The Presqu'île shown here was built in 1898 and is 428 feet in length. It was converted to a cement carrier on July 24, 1956. Prior to this, as you can see, it was drastically altered with additional cabins and a higher bow deck being added to it, as shown here. At the time it was converted for cement carrier status, it was named in honor of the chairman of Huron Portland Cement, Emery Moran Ford, nephew of John Battice Ford. Mr. Emery Ford was born in Detroit in 1906, and he graduated from Princeton in 1928. Mr. Ford was chairman of both Huron Portland Cement and Wyandotte Chemical until May 1959. By the way, Huron Portland Cement merged with National Gypsum Company in the early 1960s. National Gypsum entered into an arrangement with Lafarge Copper of France to take over cement operations in 1966. A French firm cannot own or operate Great Lakes ships, so on April 29, 1986, all the Huron vessels were sold to Scarup, that's S-K-A-A-R-U-P, Shipping of Philadelphia, and in the spring of 1987, the firm of Inland Lakes Transportation was formed to operate these ships. The E.M. Ford sank in Milwaukee Harbor in the winter of 1980, as shown here, after being repeatedly rammed into the pier by a brutal storm off of Lake Michigan. As mentioned earlier, it is still operated today by Inland Lakes Transportation, so of course it was raised and repaired after this sinking. There's an additional shot of it off of Marine City. The Wyandotte chemical plant shown here from the Babla boat to Columbia, of course, was a company created by the J.B. Ford family's merging of Michigan Alkali Company and J.B. Ford Company on December 30th, 1942. Other J.B. Ford-owned ships with Grosse Pointe connections include the St. Crapo shown here and the Paul H. Townsend, which we'll discuss in a moment. Stanford Tappan Crapo was company co-founder of Huron Portland Cement with J.B. Ford, and he served as secretary of this company until he passed away on January 26, 1939. The Crapos lived at 776 Seminole in Indian Village until Mr. Crapo's death, when Mrs. Crapo moved to Grosse Pointe City. Mr. Crapo was born in 1865 and earned his business degree from Yale in 1886. From 1922 till 1938, he was also director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. The St. Crapo shown here was built in 1927. At 402 feet, it is still operated by Inland Lakes Transportation. Paul H. Townsend was born in 1889 in New Jersey. He received a degree from Yale University in 1918 and joined Huron-Portland Cement Company in 1919. He moved up through the firm, reaching the position of chairman in 1959. He held this post until his retirement a year later. He died on November 22, 1981 at Detroit. His son, Paul Jr., currently resides at 518 Lakeland. Mr. Townsend's namesake was launched in 1945 and given the name Paul H. Townsend in 1952. In 1958, the Townsend was cut amidships at Great Lakes Engineering Works, and a 108-foot section was added at the midsection, increasing the capacity of this ship to 45,000 barrels of cement. At this point, her solid bronze propeller was found to be too small, and it was donated to the Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Belle Isle, where it can be seen today. This was the only diesel-powered ship in the Huron fleet. It is still being operated by Inland Lakes Transportation. The Ford family had 3 namesake ships, all named for the grandsons of auto pioneer Henry Ford, shown here at right. Henry Ford II, shown with his grandfather, and real namesake, is shown with his grandfather on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Henry Ford I's first car, the quadricycle, June 4th, 1946, at Greenfield Village. Henry Ford II, upon marrying in 1940, was given a wedding gift by his parents, the house at 300 Provençal. He moved from this home to 421 Lakeshore in June of 48, and finally to the home shown in this photograph, 457 Lakeshore, which he owned from 1956 until it was torn down in March of 1983. While residing primarily in Palm Beach, Florida in his last years, he moved to 160 Provençal in 1983 with his third wife, Kathy, who still retains the Provençal home. Henry Ford II was born on September 4th, 1917, and attended Yale University from 1936 till 1940. He was released from the Navy after his father Edsel's death in May of 1943 and became Ford Motor Company Vice President on December 15th, 1943. On September 30th, 1945, he became company president and then company chairman on July 13th, 1960, serving in this capacity until March 1st, 1979. Mr. Ford died at Henry Ford Hospital on September 29th, 1987. Mr. Ford's namesake ship was built by American Shipbuilding Company, while its sister ship, the Benson Ford, which we will see in a moment, was being built by Great Lakes Engineering Works. Henry Ford I, in his uncanny manner, let it be known that he intended to build a fleet of ships, then gave contracts for the first 2 ships to separate companies. The implied suggestion, of course, was that the one who built the ship he liked best would build the rest of the ships that he was about to order. Still, the Henry Ford II was Mr. Ford's favorite, and while Ford built additional ships, the number was actually limited to about 30. While the Henry Ford II was equipped with the most modern mechanical wonders of its era, including several devices that had never been installed in a ship before, and it contained the first application of a large diesel engine on a Great Lakes ship, its cabins really set it apart. By the way, throughout the remaining years of Henry Ford I's life, he passed away in 1947, the ship was known, behind his back of course, as the old man's ship. The owner's quarters accommodated 8 guests and were elaborately furnished and finished. The stateroom and private dining room were in Santo Domingo mahogany, and there were 14 kinds of inlaid wood in the dining room. The officers' quarters were similarly appointed, and aft crew quarters, those shown at the rear of the ship, were finished in English oak. The guest lounge was under the pilot house looking forward and was decorated to give one the feeling of being in an English manor house. One expected to look out the great windows to an expansive lawn rather than to water. Excuse me. The rest of the ship also tested Mr. Ford's desire to make his ship special. Deck railings and all doors were teak wood, and all hardware and fittings were of polished nickel. The Ford script on the stack at aft was illuminated with 104 electric light bulbs. The ship also carried what amounted to a self-contained elevator and shaft, which could be lowered over the side for the Fords and their guests to reach the dock. Mr. Ford would take cruises on this ship to his summer home at the Huron Mountain Club on Lake Superior. During Mr. Ford's trips, the Ford ships all would fly the Bluebird of Happiness flag. A self-unloader, showing, as you can see, the crane in the center of the ship, was added in 1974. This ship is 611 by 62 feet. Unfortunately, Ford Motor Company contracted this ship out from 1986 to 89 to move salt from the port of Cleveland, so the ship is in poor condition. It was sold in 1989 and renamed the Samuel Mather, and is docked in the Frog Pond in Toledo. There are rumors it may be activated in 1991. One of its wooden nameplates now hangs in Edsel Ford II's office. Here you see a closer shot of the self-unloader and the aft cabins. A couple of models of this ship were built as gifts for Mr. Ford. Here's one shown being auctioned off by Greenfield Village in 1982. Although this isn't a great photograph, about a 4-foot long model is now on display at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Belle Isle. This particular model was built for Mr. Ford by the students of the Ford Trade School. The second auto Ford ship was named for Henry Ford II's second grandson, Benson, shown here. Mr. Benson Ford was born on July 20th, 1919, and he lived with his wife, Lynn McNaughton, first at 906 3 Mile Drive, then 109 Kenwood, and finally 635 Lakeshore, shown here, the former Emery Clark Mansion. Mr. Ford was vice president of Lincoln Mercury Division for several years. He died on his yacht, Onika, whose name meant Kiss Me Quick in Hawaiian, and named for his parents' earlier ship. He died on this ship in Sheboygan on July 27th, 1978. The first Benson Ford namesake was built in 1924 and was 612 by 61 feet. The ship was renamed the John Dykstra in 1982. At the same time, the Ford ship John Dykstra was given the name Benson Ford. This ship was sold for scrap in the spring of 1986. There's an additional shot of that ship, and one finally taken from the stern. Finally, here it is, laid up in Cleveland, awaiting scrapping in 1986. Additional shots as it's being scrapped in Cleveland. A shot from inside the hull, giving you the massive size of a Great Lakes ship such as this, once again 65 feet in width or beam. By the way, the pilot house was removed on July 11th, 1986, as shown here. Frank Sullivan, vice president of D. Sullivan and Company, the managing firm of Gartland, G-A-R-T-L-A-N-D Steamship Company, purchased this 4,400-foot structure as his new South Bass Island cottage, as shown here. The second Benson Ford, the former John Dykstra, and by the way, Mr. Dykstra was president of Ford Motor Company following the departure of Robert McNamara to the Kennedy administration, where he became Secretary of the Navy on April 12, 1961. Mr. Dykstra was president from the time that Mr. McNamara left the company until retiring in 1963. This ship, shown here renamed the Benson Ford, was built in 1953 and was 644 by 67 feet. It was the Benson Ford from 1982 to 1985 when it was scrapped. Here it is showing awaiting scrapping in 1985. The third ship, named Benson Ford, was formerly the Edward B. Green, as shown here. It was built in 1952. It was 767 feet by 70 feet. It was sold by Ford Motor Company, and here it is shown as the Benson Ford, to Lake Shipping, and was renamed K.E. Barker in 1989. William Clay Ford, shown here, is Henry Ford I's youngest grandson. He was born on March 14, 1925. He graduated from Yale in 1949. He and his wife, Martha Firestone, first lived at 396 Provençal until building their Georgian home on Lakeshore Drive, shown here at the center, in the early 1960s. He still resides in this house today, but he retired as vice chairman of Ford Motor Company in 1989. He, of course, owns the Detroit Lions Football Club. His first namesake ship was built in 1953. Its original length, as shown here, was 647 feet. But 120 feet was added amidships in 1979, making it 767 feet. It was sold for scrap in 1985. Here it is waiting at the Nicholson Dock on the Rouge River for scrapping in 1985. Fortunately, the pilot house from this ship was salvaged at that time and was donated to the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. Unfortunately, due to a lack of funds, this pilot house was not moved to the museum until April 3rd, 1991. It is shown here about 4 days later with the crane still in place that had just lifted it in place. As you can see, the front edge of it hangs out over the seawall onto the Detroit River. Here it is shown from inside the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, hanging out over the river. The second ship named William Clay Ford was built in 1942. It was named the Walter A. Sterling, as shown here, in 1961, and it was lengthened to 826 feet in 1976. It became the William Clay Ford in 1985. It was sold by Ford Motor Company in 1989, and I'm not really sure what it was renamed, though, unfortunately. The Detroit and Cleveland Steamship Company was incorporated in 1868. Here we see the first ship named the City of Detroit, which was launched in 1878. She had a composite hull, once again wood up to the waterline, and from there steel plates welded to a metal frame. In 1881, the Newberry and Mcmillan families of Grosse Pointe invested in D&C stock. Later on, the Mcmillan family purchased the Newberry family stock. The future Senator, James Mcmillan, born in 1838, and who lived in Grosse Pointe until 1902 when he passed away, became officer of the company at this time in 1881, and then became company president in 1889. Other Mcmillans succeeded him as president of the company. They were William C. Mcmillan, who lived from 1869 to 1907, Phillip Mcmillan, who lived from 1872 to 1919, and James T. Mcmillan, 1885 to 1946. James T. Mcmillan resided for several years at 16,006 Essex in Grosse Pointe Park. As you can see here, the profile of these ships was quite tall. This happens to be the Greater Buffalo, which you'll see some interior shots of in just a minute. D&C advertising was quite interesting, as you can see here. The western states, shown here being stalled, was built in 1902 and was 350 feet by 44 feet at waterline, although as you can see the deck was quite a bit wider. It was a floating hotel, as shown here, at Tawas City from 1955 until it mysteriously burned on March 21st, 1959, when the company was losing money heavily. Shown here on the deck of this ship is Mr. Zalesnik, secretary and then president of the Marine Historical Society of Detroit for over 30 years. During this entire period, by the way, he resided at 877 University before passing away in 1989. The western states was quite opulent, as shown here. and here. At the time it was a hotel. You can see the TV set in the center. But other D&C ships were much more opulent. The city of Detroit was built in 1912, for instance, and it was the world's largest side-wheeler. Its Gothic room is now reconstructed as the Dawson Great Lakes Museum's foyer. The Greater Detroit and the Greater Buffalo, larger ships built later, were 519 feet. The grand staircase of the Greater Buffalo and the Greater Detroit had a similar one, is shown here. By the way, after James T. Mcmillan's passing in 1946, the family sold the company, and the D&C Ship Company went out of business in 1950. Several members of the Detroit Red Wings Hockey Club lived in the Grosse Pointes over the years. The ship that was named the Red Wing was given its name in 1960 and was 730 feet in length. It was scrapped on November 24th, 1986. The Red Wing's owner was not a Grosse Pointer, but he also had a ship named for him, the James Norris. He was owner of Norris Grain Company of Chicago. His namesake was 663 feet in length. Many of the slides shown in this presentation are courtesy of Greg Rudnick, who grew up at 558 Lincoln Road. He purchased the floating store, the Forest City, which he operated in Cleveland for several years. Prior to this, he was a crewman on many Ford Motor Company ships. His wife worked for many years in the Marine Division of Cleveland Cliffs, and that's where he met her. They both reside today in Cleveland. Here he is shown a little bit smaller boat with Danny Cornelli. Mr. Cornelli is currently Marine Director of Inland Steel in Chicago. Mr. Cornelli, of course, of the cement family fame, grew up on University Road in Grosse Pointe. Unfortunately, I do not have a good slide of the ship, the South American, although you can see that this is taken from the South American here. The South American and the North American were owned by many years by the Hack family of Grosse Pointe. In addition to the ships you've seen here, there was also a ship named the Thomas W. Palmer. Palmer Park of the Cross of Detroit and Merrill Palmer Institute are named for him. It was launched in 1880 at 216 feet. It had a steel hull. Mr. Palmer was born in Detroit in 1830, engaged in brokerage of timber lands with his partner, Charles Merrill, and he had a financial stake in Detroit Steamship Navigation Company and Michigan Lakes Navigation Company. Also, there was a ship named the D.M. Whitney, named for David Marshall Whitney in 1901. At 428 feet, it was renamed Edwin L. Booth in 1913. Its last name was Buckeye. It was steel and had a self-unloader, and this ship ran until the mid-1970s. As we see the sun rise here on Lake St. Clair, unfortunately, the connection of Grosse Pointe to Great Lakes shipping is actually setting, though, as very few ships are still named for Grosse Pointers. There are actually only 4 still in operation. None have been named for Grosse Pointers in several years, and no Grosse Pointe families have any connections that I'm aware of with any Great Lakes shipping company.